The midday sun blazed down on Rome, its golden light bouncing off marble facades, bronze statues, and the polished armor of the Praetorian Guard. The city was restless. Every alley, every market square hummed with anticipation. Bread had been distributed early that morning, a gesture from the emperor to keep his citizens in good spirits, and now the masses were flowing toward the greatest theater of violence the world had ever known, the Colosseum. For the people of Rome, the Munera, the gladiatorial games, were more than entertainment. They were a spectacle of power, a ritual that stitched the fabric of society together. It was here, in this vast amphitheater, that the emperor displayed his generosity, his strength, and his divine favor. And it was here, too, that life and death played out as public theater, reinforcing the brutal truth of Rome: all glory was fleeting. As the gates opened, a tidal wave of citizens poured into the tiers. Senators in white togas claimed their marble seats near the imperial box. Merchants and craftsmen jostled for spots in the mid-tier benches, while laborers, slaves, and foreigners packed the upper levels. All eyes eventually drifted upward to the central figure seated in gilded splendor, the emperor himself. His presence turned the day from mere sport into an affirmation of imperial dominance. From beneath the arena floor came the sounds that fed the crowd's appetite: the metallic clink of chains, the growl of caged animals, and the muttered prayers of men about to fight for their lives. Behind those heavy wooden gates stood the gladiators, men who lived in the shadow between legend and death. To the public, they were both despised and adored, slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war, yet also heroes whose courage could eclipse that of any legionary. The Colosseum itself was a marvel of engineering, capable of seating over 50,000 souls. Its very design reflected the organized chaos of Rome's military machine. Beneath its sands, a network of hypogeum tunnels allowed for elaborate staging. Beasts could appear as if from nowhere, entire sets could be hoisted into place, and combatants could be brought into the arena with theatrical flair. It was a place designed for awe, and for fear. Today's games promised more than the usual bloodletting. Rumors had been swirling through the streets for days that one of the emperor's personal favorites would be fighting, a man whose skill and composure had turned him into something of a legend among the capital's blood-hungry elite. His name, whispered in excitement by the crowd, was Marcus Attilius, though many in the stands did not know his origin, nor how a man once bound in chains had risen to such renown. The emperor leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the arched gate from which the champion would emerge. He was not here merely to be entertained. Political unrest simmered in the provinces, whispers of dissent reached even the marble halls of the Palatine, and the games were his way of reminding Rome's people who held the power to grant both spectacle and survival. An emperor who could command life and death in the arena was an emperor who could command life and death in the empire. The trumpets blared, silencing the chatter of thousands. From the Porta Triumphalis a procession entered, attendants bearing the banners of Rome, musicians with drums and flutes, and finally the gladiators themselves. Some were heavily armored murmillos, their crested helmets gleaming. Others were nimble retiarii, carrying nets and tridents. Each type had its own style, its own fans, its own reputation for victory or savagery. And then he appeared. Attilius stepped into the sunlight, the roar of the crowd swelling like a tide. His helmet was plain, unadorned, a mark of practicality over vanity. His eyes scanned the seats, not with arrogance, but with the measured calm of a man who had survived enough battles to know that every one could be his last. He carried the short, deadly gladius, the very weapon that had conquered empires, and a rectangular scutum shield, its edges scarred from past fights. To many in the stands, his presence was more than exciting, it was reassuring. Attilius was known for fighting with a code, he did not toy with the defeated, and he refused the cruelty that some champions reveled in. This honor paradoxically made his fights more thrilling, for it meant that when he killed, it was because he had no choice, and the crowd knew it. Beneath the cheers lay another layer of tension. Rome's games were a controlled chaos, but they were also a reflection of its politics. Gladiators could be bought, sold, or bribed. Victories could be orchestrated. And while the people screamed for blood, the emperor and his advisors often watched for signs of disloyalty, among the fighters, the trainers, even the guards. The first match began, and the sands quickly darkened with blood. Attilius was not yet called, but every moment built toward his appearance. The emperor's gaze flicked between the arena and his Praetorian guard, stationed discreetly among the stands. In this vast amphitheater, there were as many political plots as there were grains of sand. The day was only beginning, but already a feeling hung in the air, something heavier than the usual thrill of the games. History was turning its wheels, unseen by the crowd. And before the sun set on Rome, the man now standing in the shadows beneath the arena would step into the light, not just as a fighter, but as the savior of an emperor. The roar of the Colosseum was a far cry from the cries of the battlefield where Marcus Attilius's story began. He had not been born to the sands, he had been born free. His earliest memories were of sunlit fields far from Rome's marble heart, of a language now lost to his tongue, and of a people who defied the legions until the day their defiance failed. Captured in the chaos of Rome's relentless expansion, Attilius had been marched in chains alongside other prisoners of war. The road to Rome was a long procession of humiliation, paraded through provincial towns, jeered at by citizens who saw in them the spoils of conquest. By the time he reached the capital, his fate had been decided. He was to be sold to a lanista, a gladiator trainer who saw human beings as both investments and commodities. The ludus, the gladiator school, was a world of its own, walled off from the city and guarded like a fortress. Here, discipline was absolute. The doctors, former fighters themselves, drilled the men until muscle replaced fear and reflex replaced hesitation. Wooden swords struck against wooden shields in endless repetition until every stance, every strike, every dodge became second nature. The food was rich in barley and beans, meant to build mass. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and oil. For Attilius, the transition from free man to gladiator was not merely physical but psychological. Survival meant learning the strange hierarchies within the ludus, veterans who commanded respect, newcomers who were tested mercilessly, and the silent understanding that every friendship was shadowed by the possibility of one day standing on opposite sides of the arena. Yet even here, bonds were formed, not out of sentiment, but necessity. Trust could mean the difference between life and death in a paired fight. His first match was not against a man but a beast, a test often given to newcomers. Released into the arena with only a spear, he faced a half-starved leopard, its ribs visible beneath its spotted coat, its eyes alight with hunger and rage. The crowd had expected a quick, brutal end, but Attilius's movements were deliberate. He dodged, sidestepped, and waited until the animal lunged fully before driving the spear home in a single, clean motion. It was over in moments, and with it, the crowd had found someone worth watching. Over the next months, Attilius's reputation grew. He was not the most flamboyant fighter, nor the strongest, but his discipline was unmatched. He fought like a soldier rather than an entertainer, conserving energy, exploiting weaknesses, and ending fights decisively. The people came to respect the quiet intensity in his eyes, the absence of cruelty in his kills, and the strange dignity he carried even when covered in blood. In the rigid economy of the games, a gladiator who won consistently was worth far more alive than dead. Attilius's lanista saw profit in keeping him on the roster for the grander events, festivals, imperial birthdays, and politically charged games where the outcome could sway public opinion. These appearances brought him closer to the emperor's notice. During one such set of games, Attilius found himself fighting in the finale of the day, the Summa Rutus match, before the imperial box itself. His opponent was a Thracian of towering stature, armed with a curved Sicca blade. The fight was fast, brutal, and unpredictable. Twice, Attilius was nearly brought down, but each time he recovered with a counterstrike that pushed the match to its limit. When the final blow landed, a shield bash that knocked the Thracian to the ground and a gladius point held steady at his throat, the emperor rose from his seat. With a flick of his hand, he granted the sign of mercy. The crowd erupted, but it was not the Thracian they cheered for, it was the man who had earned both the emperor's and the people's respect. From that day forward, Attilius was no longer just another name on the day's program. He was a figure the crowd waited for, a man whose presence could elevate an entire afternoon of games. But with fame came attention, and with attention came risk, for in Rome, a man beloved by the masses could be seen as a threat to those who wielded power. And in the corridors of the Palatine Hill, where whispers carried further than shouts, Attilius's name had begun to be spoken in connection with the emperor himself. The emperor sat upon the most precarious throne in the ancient world. To the public, he was the embodiment of Rome itself, a man who commanded the legions, controlled the Senate, and dispensed life or death with a gesture. But behind the marble facades and gilded ceremonies lay a truth every emperor knew: the palace was as dangerous as the battlefield. It had been a turbulent season for the empire. In the north, legions were bogged down in a grinding campaign against Germanic tribes, their progress slowed by weather and ambush. In the east, governors grumbled about tax burdens and whispered of revolt. Even within Rome's walls, the Senate was split between loyalists and those who quietly courted the favor of the emperor's rivals. The Praetorian Guard, sworn protectors of the emperor, were themselves a double-edged sword. Well paid and fiercely trained, they could put down a riot in moments. But they were also kingmakers. History had seen more than one emperor rise or fall by the will of these men, whose loyalty could be bought or betrayed for the right price. Rumors had begun to drift through the capital, talk of discontent among the guard's higher officers, hints of meetings in shadowed courtyards, and unexplained changes in the emperor's security patterns. For a ruler who lived under the constant threat of assassination, these were not idle whispers, they were warning signs. And yet Rome still demanded spectacle. Canceling the games was unthinkable, it would signal weakness. The Colosseum was as much a political stage as a place of entertainment, and the emperor knew that the people's adoration could buy him precious time against conspirators. A ruler who could stir the crowd into frenzy was harder to topple. The day of the great festival approached, a celebration in honor of a recent military victory in the Balkans. It was to be one of the largest sets of games in recent years. Exotic beasts from Africa, naval reenactments flooded into the arena, and of course the climactic gladiatorial bouts. The emperor's advisors urged caution. Some even suggested limiting his appearance to the opening ceremonies. But the emperor, determined to display strength, insisted on presiding over the entire day. It was no coincidence that Marcus Attilius was scheduled to fight during the prime hours of the games, when the crowd's energy would peak and the emperor's presence would be most visible. The two had met briefly after Attilius's victory against the Thracian, and though their exchange had been formal, it had left an impression on both men. For the emperor, the gladiator represented a rare kind of loyalty, the kind forged not by politics, but by shared respect. But loyalty alone could not shield an emperor from treachery. Beyond the arena's gates, in the twisting alleys of Rome, knives were being sharpened and messages passed between conspirators. Among them were men who knew the emperor's habits, his guards' routines, and the precise moment when his life would be most vulnerable. That moment would come not in some darkened street or lonely corridor, but in the full blaze of the Colosseum, when the emperor's attention was fixed on the sands below, and when the roar of the crowd would drown out the sound of an assassin's footsteps. The festival dawned bright and clear, as though the gods themselves had granted Rome a perfect day for spectacle. From the Forum to the Flavian Amphitheater, the streets pulsed with color and sound. Vendors shouted over the din, peddling honeyed figs, roasted chestnuts, and watered wine. Trumpets blared to announce the start of the games, their calls echoing off marble columns. Inside the Colosseum, every seat was filled. Senators reclined in their privileged rows, patricians chatted over cups of spiced wine, and in the upper tiers the poor and enslaved shouted with unrestrained anticipation. All eyes turned toward the imperial box as the emperor entered, clad in a white toga edged with purple, the color of absolute authority. He raised a hand, and the crowd's roar swelled like a tidal wave. The early bouts set the rhythm for the day, pairs of murmillos and hoplomachi clashing in controlled fury, exotic animals loosed upon the sands, acrobatic hunters dodging the slashes of tigers and the horns of bulls. But the murmurs in the crowd were already building toward the headline match, Marcus Attilius versus a veteran secutor known as Cassius the Red, famed for his brutal, unrelenting style. As the attendants prepared the arena for the fight, the emperor leaned forward in his seat, exchanging a few quiet words with his praefectus praetorio. To the casual observer, it was simply the ruler taking interest in the match. But elsewhere in the arena, among the praetorian ranks, a different conversation was taking place, in glances, in subtle nods, in the shifting of hands toward concealed blades. The gate creaked open and Attilius stepped into the sunlight. Across the sand, Cassius emerged, his helmet smooth, featureless faceplate gleaming like a mask of death. The crowd roared at the sight of two champions, their reputations forged in blood, meeting in the sands for the first time. The opening exchanges were fast and brutal. Cassius pressed forward, his heavy shield battering at Attilius's defenses, his short sword probing for a gap in the guard. Attilius yielded ground strategically, conserving energy, waiting for the moment when his opponent's aggression would create an opening. The rhythm of attack and counterattack kept the crowd locked in rapture. Then, the shift. Out of the corner of his eye, Attilius noticed movement in the imperial box that didn't match the crowd's rhythm, a figure among the praetorians stepping closer to the emperor, hands slipping beneath the folds of his cloak. The crowd's roar masked the sound of a blade leaving its sheath, but not to trained eyes. Without thought, Attilius broke from the fight. The crowd gasped in confusion as he sprinted across the sand, his gladius flashing in the sun. Cassius, stunned, lowered his weapon, unsure whether this was part of some staged drama. In the imperial box, the assassin lunged, but Attilius was already in motion, launching himself upward onto the platform. Steel met steel with a ring that cut through the noise. The assassin staggered back, surprised not by a guard but by a man in a gladiator's armor. Attilius drove forward, shield slamming into the attacker's chest, sword slicing across his weapon arm. The blade clattered to the marble floor. The praetorians nearest the emperor hesitated, in that single, dangerous moment their loyalty weighed against fear. But when Attilius forced the would-be killer to the ground, the spell broke. Guards surged in, wrestling the man away, dragging him toward the vomitorium for interrogation. The emperor, breathless but unscathed, stood. He looked at Attilius, still kneeling, sword in hand, sand and marble dust on his armor. For a long moment the two men locked eyes, ruler and gladiator bound by the raw fact that one had just saved the other's life. Then the emperor raised his arm to the crowd. A roar like no other erupted, the sound shaking the very stones of the amphitheater. The fight with Cassius was forgotten, the festival itself became a living legend in that instant. Attilius did not bask in the adulation. He knew too well that in Rome, glory was a fleeting thing. The assassin's failure today meant safety for the emperor, but also danger for himself. For in saving the ruler of Rome, he had placed himself squarely in the spotlight of imperial politics, where gratitude could turn to suspicion with alarming speed. The Colosseum's roar still echoed through the streets of Rome long after the assassin had been dragged away. News of the attack spread with the speed of wildfire, retold in taverns, whispered in marketplaces, embroidered with new details at every retelling. In every version, one fact remained constant: a gladiator had saved the emperor's life before the eyes of the entire city. By the time the emperor returned to the Palatine Hill under heavy guard, the Senate was already in uproar. Loyalists hailed the emperor's survival as proof of divine favor, while rivals privately fumed at the sudden surge in his public standing. The attempted assassination, though a danger, had also created a moment of political opportunity. For Marcus Attilius, the hours following the attack were a blur. He was taken from the Colosseum not back to the Ludus, but to the imperial palace itself, a place he had only glimpsed from afar. The marble corridors and gilded ceilings were a world apart from the rough barracks and training sands he had known. Yet here too, the air was thick with tension. Servants and guards alike eyed him with a mix of awe, curiosity, and suspicion. The emperor summoned him privately that evening. Attilius entered the audience chamber without his helmet, the scars of his profession visible under the lamplight. The emperor studied him in silence for a long moment before speaking, not as a ruler to a slave, but as one soldier to another. He asked why Attilius had acted without hesitation, why he had abandoned his fight to cross the arena. Attilius's answer was simple: because you were in danger, Caesar. And because in that moment there was no one else between you and death. It was an answer that pleased the emperor, but it also unsettled him. A man who acted without orders, guided only by instinct and honor, was a man difficult to control. Rewarding such a figure could inspire loyalty, but it could also breed envy among the elite. In the days that followed, debate raged within the imperial court. Some advisors urged the emperor to quietly return Attilius to the games, granting him a purse of gold and perhaps a promise of freedom after a final series of bouts. Others suggested making him a public symbol of imperial favor, a gesture that would bind the people's admiration to the throne. The emperor chose the latter. On the steps of the Forum, before a crowd called together by decree, the emperor himself announced that Marcus Attilius was to be granted rudis, the wooden sword that marked a gladiator's formal freedom. But the honor did not end there. The freedman would serve henceforth as part of the emperor's personal guard, a protector who owed his loyalty not to politics or coin, but to a debt of survival shared between them. The crowd's cheer was thunderous, yet Attilius felt the weight of his new station settle on his shoulders. He had escaped the certainty of the arena's sands, but stepped into an even more treacherous battlefield, the shifting alliances and silent daggers of imperial Rome. Somewhere in the shadows of the Forum, men who had once plotted the emperor's death watched the scene unfold. And in their eyes, the man who had interfered with their plans was no hero, but an obstacle to be removed. Years passed, and the memory of that fateful day in the Colosseum took on the polish of legend. In taverns and marketplaces, the story grew taller with each telling. Some swore Attilius had leapt the full height of the arena wall in a single bound, others claimed he had slain 3 assassins before reaching the emperor. The truth mattered less than the effect. The gladiator's name became synonymous with loyalty and courage. As a member of the emperor's personal guard, Attilius moved through the empire's most guarded spaces. He stood in the marble corridors of power, listened to the quiet negotiations that shaped the fate of provinces, and learned that the political world was far more dangerous than the arena ever was. The enemies he faced now carried not swords, but scrolls, seals, and whispered promises of betrayal. Yet unlike many who rose in the emperor's service, Attilius never forgot the sands. He often walked the streets near the Colosseum in a plain tunic, watching the new generation of fighters train in the litis. Some recognized him and greeted him as a hero, others, too young to remember, only saw a broad-shouldered man with the bearing of a soldier. Rome itself changed. Emperors rose and fell. The games continued, though never without the undercurrent of danger they had always carried. But Attilius's story endured because it bridged 2 worlds, the brutality of the arena and the intrigue of the court. He had been both a pawn in Rome's games and a player in its highest politics. In time, he left the emperor's service with honor, his life spared the violent end that claimed so many in Rome's shadowed corridors. He returned to a modest villa on the city's outskirts, where the sound of the Colosseum was a distant echo on festival days. It was said that in his final years, he would sit outside at dusk, polishing the wooden rudis that had set him free, the fading light catching in the grain as if it still held the sunlit sand of the arena. The Colosseum still stands in ruin today, its arches weathered but unbroken. Tourists walk where emperors once sat, where gladiators once fought, and where one man, neither noble nor senator, but a slave who refused to stand idle, changed the course of an empire in the space of a heartbeat. And though time has eroded the details, the essence remains, that in the heart of Rome, in an age of ambition and blood, a gladiator once saved an emperor's life.